Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the No Name Cinema Society, the film review show that dares to dig just a little bit deeper. And this is episode 64.3, our classic movie discussion. And tonight we're going to be discussing the film The Jolson Story from 1946. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler. I'm one of your hosts here this evening. I'm still in Astoria, New York, cat sitting for the time being, and it will be for the next couple episodes to close out our sixth season. With me for tonight's discussion, my co-host, if you will. First, ladies and gentlemen, one of the greatest minstrel performers in the history of Jeopardy, the Jeopardy champ himself, Jim Carroll's here.
No, we're not going to accept that.
He's got a beard.
I do have a beard. That is new. Most people often accuse my marriage of being a beard, but in this case, I actually physically have one.
That's not the first time he's used that joke, is my estimation. That's come up before. And also, ladies and gentlemen, his long-suffering friend and agent who discovered Jim at the age of 12, Max Fauno the Enigma, is here.
Jim's on this show? That's amazing.
So good to see you.
They've never met, but it's fun. Here we are. They're meeting now. Jim, Max, Jim.
Lots of waves. Waves going on everywhere.
There you go. All right, so I'm going to go over our schedule for this, our 64th series of episodes, which started last Thursday and continued this past Monday with our indie spotlight, Me and Earl and the Dying Girl. And of course, tonight is the classic movie discussion. And coming up this Monday is our 48th sound off. We're going to have Devin and Patrick, and we're going to play the movie game. Devin's got a diatribe, and I am going to count down top 5 actor biopics of all time based on our discussion of the Jolson story this evening. So guys, it's time for drinking. You guys aren't really drinkers historically. Is anybody going to drink with me?
I mean, this is definitely not bourbon.
This here is a cold hot toddy.
There you go. I like tot toddies.
It's a cold toddy.
It's a cold toddy. I've got Brooklyn Lager. The people I'm cat sitting for, they left me some Brooklyn Lager and asked me to drink it. So
it's very nice of them.
Drink it, I will. Those of you out in audience land out there, movie fans, you can drink with me, and cheers to you all. So now it's time for the trivia for this particular show tonight. On the last show, the last classic, the trivia I gave saying that we had one more classic coming up to close our 6th season, which is tonight. And just like last year, our final classic of the year will be a film that's celebrating its 75th anniversary. And it's a biopic about someone involved in one of the biggest game changers in film history, and that was the trivia. Al Jolson, of course, was the star of the very first sound film, The Jazz Singer, in 1927. This biopic about his life came out in 1946, and as I said, it's celebrating its 75th anniversary this year, so it's a perfect film to close out our 6th season. It was green-lit after the success of one of our 1942 films, Jim, which should be obvious to you.
Wow, way to put me on the spot here.
Which one of our films was a biopic about
Pride of the Yankees.
About a singer?
A biopic about a singer.
Yankee Doodle Dandy.
Oh, Yankee Doodle Dandy.
Of course, it's the film that led to this film being greenlit. The biopic on George M. Cohan, a patriotic contemporary of Jolson. Al Jolson is somewhat forgotten now for reasons that will likely become obvious over the course of the discussion, but he was by far the biggest star and entertainer of the 20s. The level of his popularity cannot be understated. Far more popular than Cohan ever was, though granted Cohan was sometimes more behind the scenes. 1946, incidentally, gentlemen, remains the most successful year at the box office in American cinema history when adjusted for inflation. The soldiers had just gotten back from the war, and the movies provided a fairly inexpensive escape from the national horror and trauma from the first half of the decade. The biggest films of this landmark year include The Best Years of Our Lives, which would win the Oscar for Best Picture, among many others, Duel in the Sun, and in third place, even ahead of It's Wonderful Life at the box office, The Jolson Story. So this was a pretty big film in its year, guys. Are you guys, that was the trivia. So the trivia's out of the way. You guys ready?
Brilliant.
For a summary?
Yes.
Unless you want to comment on trivia. Does anybody have trivia comments?
No, that was some solid trivia.
Okay.
Very good trivia.
All right.
I did not know about 1946 being the highest grossing year ever.
All right, summary. The Jolson Story. Asa Jolson loves to sing. Vaudeville journeyman Steve Martin discovers that he's really, really good at it and adds him to his act, eventually changing the young singer's name to Al Jolson, who will become one of the most successful recording and Broadway stars in the early part of the 20th century. So guys, how was that summary?
Excellent.
Yeah, good summary.
Good summary.
Really,
Yeah.
really good. A+.
I love the positive reinforcement tonight, guys. A+ to you guys. Keep it coming. Opening thoughts. Jim is historically terrible at opening thoughts, so we'll see if he can improve this evening, which is why I'm going to let Max go first. Not that Max has been very good at it yet, but you know, he's had less practice. So I'm going to see if Max can improve, if he can just have a succinct sentence or less. How did you feel about the film?
Opening thoughts. Just, you know, this movie, as seen through today's eyes, incredibly racist, very interesting, but really, really incredibly racist.
And Jim, opening thoughts for you. Did you like the film?
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Before I get my opening thoughts, I always give the screening notes, which we had the screening in December of 2018. Every year on Christmas Eve, we have a special screening for a group in New Jersey, and this was that annual screening that year. Most of the audience hadn't even heard of Al Jolson, let alone the film, and most of the audience were surprised by how much they enjoyed it and got caught up in it. And for my opening thoughts, I also thought it was a lot better and almost subversively deeper than I thought it was going to be. I actually think it's a great film. So guys, I normally like to start in the positive, but I mean, you know, it seems like the issue is the blackface in the film. Al Jolson, that is his career. So when making a film about Al Jolson, I don't know how you do it without blackface. So
Right.
Do we want to address the issue of the minstrel aspect of this first? I don't think that that's how we want to evaluate the film in terms of good or bad. I mean, Jim, I assume your face is strictly because of the racism.
There are many things. And I think you and I are going to disagree a lot on this film because I think there were moments, there were really good seeds, but I think ultimately there were too many problems with it. If we want to address the minstrel part, it's really difficult to sit through now. Just being presented with things like Dumbo and the Crow chorus is hard, but I think this is so much more difficult.
Because of the amount of it.
To see in 1946 a movie that was made about 20 years prior, and like not only was it accepted, but there was no other commentary on it other than this is great and part of his career and let's move on. So even 20 years later, this was still absolutely okay. I mean, that's sort of what blew my mind.
Well, like, you know, you only watched 25 films from 1942. I watched 75 films from 1942, and I would say at least a dozen of them, and it's only 4 years before this, a dozen of them featured blackface from some of the more memorable and famous actors of all time. Judy Garland in blackface, Mickey Rooney in blackface, Fred Astaire in blackface, Bing Crosby in blackface, all in films from 1942. There's no commentary because it was a widely accepted practice.
Yes, the Judy Garland, Mickey Rooney, it's a routine. It's part of the movie. It's not the whole. And the Jolson story, it's so much of that first half of the movie.
Should the film be erased? Are we banning books now?
No. I don't think that the film should be erased. In fact, I think Warner Brothers was the first to do it. They released their cartoon vault. There's the disclaimer up front of, hey, look, this is really racist. And it's a product of its time, and we do not stand by it. But to remove these is to erase the history and to excuse this action by removing it. It's better to look at this and see it. And I do sort of stand by it.
And I want to make the point, I acknowledge that minstrel shows and blackface are sad and extremely exploited practice that perpetuated racist stereotypes that took years to undo. But it is a part of our history, an unfortunate one. Just like slavery, segregation is a very sad and unfortunate part of our history, both of which are racist and both of which have movies made about them even still. The fact remains that Al Jolson is a major historical figure whose massive success and legacy has been tainted by the practice that is now considered highly inappropriate. But the fact remains that it was not highly inappropriate, not only in the time that he was doing it, but in the time that this film was made. These things evolve even within our lifetime. I remember a time when the N-word was bandied about on broadcast television, on prime time, that would never happen to now. It would be considered unconscionable. But the filmmakers themselves can't be blamed for including it because, as it happens, a good 10% of the films from the era featured blackface in some way, shape, or form. And I can't say for sure if they knew it was racist. I don't know if they did, and if they did, they certainly didn't seem to care. But more importantly, it was culturally acceptable and at the time as shameful as it may be. So we can watch the film knowing how inappropriate the practice was. The larger concern for me is how audiences wanted to be it. I think for Al Jolson, in Al Jolson's case, if pooping on stage when it was hugely popular, Al Jolson would have found a way to like become the best pooper on stage.
Yeah, I mean, look at it this way. When you see the Judy Garland and Mickey Rooney routine, I tend to sit through that with gritted teeth. That is a lot of how I watch this movie, with like, okay, breathing exercises. We're just
sure, but my feeling is, as film critics or discussers, as we tend to, and this is an important discussion to have, and if we want to have it up top, that's fine. I do think we need to divorce ourselves as much as we can, because we're evaluating it not based on things that they couldn't possibly be aware of.
Sure, there's a yes.
Well, so I'm just going to jump in here for a second. I think that is a dangerous thing to say, things that they couldn't possibly be aware of, because on a certain level, I'm not sure that the blackface is the most overtly racist aspect of this film. They even have a scene where he goes off to the jazz band. A group of African-American jazz players inspire him so much that he nearly misses his entrance in the vaudeville show. The thing that's so tragic about this film, we decide not to acknowledge that this guy is just taking from one cultural group and making tremendous amounts of money off of it, becoming hugely popular. Whether or not he's great at it or not, I think is almost irrelevant in the aspect of looking at this as emblematic of racism. And I think that is the most stunning thing about the film. I'm not saying this film is the only thing to do this. I'm not condemning this film as uniquely racist. I'm not suggesting that Al Jolson wasn't doing something to a higher level than some of his contemporaries. I'm just saying that. I
also want to point out he was hardly the first. Like he was actually from the last.
There is the movie by itself as a standalone piece of art, and the metatextual context of history that weighs down upon that. And it is in this particular case very hard to divorce that, especially given the very recent history.
Right. I have no problem divorcing it. Like but then again, I have no problem listening to Bill Cosby or watching Kevin Spacey or anything else that has been considered canceled.
I think it hits people at different levels.
I want to add, though, JB, I'm not for canceling any of what we're talking about. I think this is actually really important, really useful right now to use this film as an example of American history.
I agree with that.
If you think of racism, it's something that is not dead. And if we don't face it, we don't look at it, and we don't address it, then it's probably as bad as being racist to begin with. By looking at this film, by examining it, you can see its noteworthiness in terms of its artistic elements, as you're very admirably championing, but you can also see that you can't really divorce it from the fact that they chose to further propagate cultural norms that were completely and terribly racist.
They didn't see it that way.
I don't think that's an excuse. I think that's just something to acknowledge.
You don't know what you don't know. In 20 years, there are things that we think that are innocuous today that we can look back and what were we thinking about? You just assume that everything that we do today is going to be culturally acceptable 20 years down the line. It's very easy for us to look back and say that was racist. But
You're right.
And given how big a part of it, of the film culture anyway, because that's the only thing that I have to look at, given how big in the film culture it was, and given how liberal Hollywood was, one has to assume that they didn't think twice about it. I'll give you an example. 1936 is in Swing Time. Fred Astaire, who's generally known to be like one of the sweetest guys, working in Hollywood, but Mr. Bojangles, the tap dancer, had died a little bit before they made the film. And so he wanted to honor him in his mind by doing a number in the film Swing Time that he choreographed with his colleague Hermes Pan, etc. And he wanted to honor, Bojangles. He did it in blackface, thinking that was honoring his friend, someone he admired as a dancer. I screened that film a couple of different times, and similar reactions have come up. In his mind, he is paying homage. It's very easy for us to be like, well, that's racist. Yeah, I mean, certainly in hindsight, it is. If I looked inside Fred Astaire's heart, I'd be surprised if he knowingly thought it was racist, you know?
I see what you're saying in terms of the individuals involved at that time period.
I think both things are true. We can talk about Al Jolson's place in history. We can look at the movie and try and take it apart on its artistic merits. There is always going to be that weight of our perspective. We were born 30 to 40 years after this.
Look at Jim trying to pretend that he was born in the 80s.
It's hard for me to watch it because it was so widely accepted.
When you watch films about slavery or segregation, do you feel the same way? Is it hard for you to watch?
Here's the difference between it. When we're watching movies about slavery and segregation, we're seeing the mistreatment. It is an assumed bad thing. We very rarely see movies where the slaves are enjoying their conditions. And in this movie, he puts on blackface and everybody gives him a standing ovation. That, I think, is the friction.
Which is a part of the conversation, certainly. Like, I don't understand the enjoyment of it necessarily. However, I can divorce it. Just like I can see Bill Cosby as a bad man versus his work, which I find very admirable and impressive over the course of his career. I can see this movie as a work of art versus blackface as a practice. And again, as far as Al Jolson's concerned, he would have done whatever was popular. Like today, he'd be a YouTube star. I don't think he was necessarily about, I want to do blackface. I think he just wanted to be a star.
I think what Jim said is the most pertinent. What we've got here is a movie that chooses to not acknowledge the world that it's perpetuating.
The concept of choosing is where I really bump Max, because I mean, like, they're choosing to make a movie about one of the biggest stars of the era because they think they would make them money. I don't know that they're consciously thinking that this is wrong.
That's the friction.
Exactly.
How do they know what they don't know?
They can't, because they are in that situation. I'm sure there were people who were acknowledging
Absolutely.
that. For me, watching it, it's not that they aren't exploring the inequalities. The friction is that they couldn't. That, for me, is the voice in the back of my head.
None of the film of the time could.
Let's look at Gone with the Wind. Let's look at Riefenstahl. There are technical and artistic achievements in those films where you can divorce or at least set aside some of the worst aspects of what they are celebrating and say, oh my God, like Leni Riefenstahl, she was able to do these amazing shots. Okay, right. It's at a horrible event, but we can completely divorce the meaning and just say this.
Birth of a Nation, perhaps, as well?
Absolutely.
Birth of a Nation, too, has importance into film history. I don't know if the Jolson story comes up to the level of quality where the artistic merit of the movie rises above the racist elements in it.
I would have to agree with Jim. Although this film has lots of qualities, it is inextricably sewn into the fabric of the history of this country with racism. This movie has qualities. It would be ridiculous to say that it doesn't. There are beautiful, beautiful aspects of this film, but to ignore the fact that it chooses to ignore how racist it is crazy.
I mean, like, the only thing, I mean, like, and it's starting to get circular, so I do think we need to move on, because it's just the word chooses that really, really bothers me, because I mean, like, it suggests that they were aware of something and went ahead with it anyway. I'd be very surprised if that were the case, just given how prominent it was in the culture.
Which is why I think this is such an important movie for people to see, because this is endemic of the times, ignoring what's going on. The fact that Hollywood is incredibly racist.
Now, you said is, I mean...
Well, I'm speaking as if it were 1946, but I think it really still is. You look at the representation today, it's an example of racism permeating today as well.
Well, that's another discussion, but I think it's time to talk about the film itself, if we can. Max suggested that there were a couple things that he may have liked about it. The thing that I liked the most about it are the performances, actually. I had never heard of Larry Parks prior to rewatching this film in December of 2018, because I watched it when I was a kid, like 5 or 6 years old. I saw this film. And there's a good reason I've never heard of Larry Parks, which I'll get to. With that said, I was floored by this performance, which incorporates but goes way beyond mere mimicry. Though his speaking voice and Jolson's singing voice were vastly different, Parks nailed every bit of the demeanor and movement that was so well known with Jolson. And he wasn't hampered by the lip syncing, which can sometimes be a problem. I feel like he owned it. But that was just his onstage persona. Offstage, Parks brought an undeniable energy to the role of the man that captured the overwhelming drive and ambition of the character. His commitment to detail even rivals, to me, that of Jimmy Cagney in Yankee Doodle Dandy. I think it's a remarkable transformation for Larry Parks. And perhaps most impressive to me at all, especially for its time, is that he doesn't become the Jolson we know. It's not a switch. He builds up to it, gradually growing into both the man and the myth, guys. I was amazed by the performance and the level of detail.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think the performances, and not just from Larry Parks, who I agree with you, did a great job.
I'm going to get to the other one.
Across the board, there were actually really nice, nuanced performances.
I want to get to the other ones momentarily, but I want to start with Larry Parks.
No, Larry Parks did a great job. I know he actually sort of pushed himself in for this role.
It's a great kind of story because he was like almost like a background actor, somebody who was like, and he got bit parts here and there, including in one of our 1942 films, You Were Never Lovelier. And you had never had a starring role. He auditions for this. You love that, especially in those days. The auditions weren't happening as much. You were assigned the parts that you got. He auditioned for it, got an Oscar nomination, and does what I think is a truly terrific job. Let's see if Max agrees.
JB, one of the things I enjoy so much about this program, about watching you, is you see your passion, your love for what really comes through in movies. And I think Larry Parks is a perfect example of that. He was amazing in the movie. The thing that I thought was so incredible was he did something very few people, I think, are able to do. Maybe
he's having a what's his bucket moment, Jim. That's a famous phrase from Jim. He always says what's his bucket when he can't remember his name. And we turned it into a segment.
He's so good at being huge and intimate at the same time. So you're stunned a little bit, like, wait a minute, I probably shouldn't be accepting this on a two-dimensional screen, and then you're completely drawn in and you accept it. He's got real feelings, you know?
That's a beautiful way of putting it. That was very eloquent. Anything else, Jim? Because I want to wrap up Larry Parks.
No, I think Max actually hit the nail on the head. And I think that's part of it's nice to see that. It's you understand how easily Jolson was able to win over the crowds. Parks really carried that through. You got that sense.
It's funny, just for our audio listening audience, I just want to point out that Max, when Jim said he nailed it on the head, Max felt the need to mime that for us.
It's an homage to Larry Parks.
Was he also a mime? I will tell you, he became a star after Jolson's story, but his career took a nosedive after a tearful testimony before the House of Un-American Activities and left him blacklisted. It's a very sad thing. Although he did wind up naming names, he was blacklisted anyway. He wound up becoming an apartment owner and mogul in New York City with his wife, Betty Garrett, who most of you know as Edna on Laverne and Shirley, their landlord. Larry Parks is also the godfather, and Jim, as the Jeopardy champ, you probably know this, the godfather of an Oscar-winning actor.
Jeff Bridges.
Sorry, that's wrong. It's who is Jeff Bridges. So anyway, yes, Larry Parks is Jeff Bridges' godfather. So that's my little trivia tidbit on Larry Parks. Are we good to move on to the next performance?
Yes.
Let's talk about William Demarest. Spent most of his career as a comic relief, usually for Preston Sturges, and almost always a pleasure to have on screen. Jim might remember him from two Preston Sturges films from our 1942 in review. Jim?
I don't. It's one of those things where I was like, I've seen this guy before, and I could not think of where it was.
Two Preston Sturges films, like that should narrow it down, in 1942.
Oh,
one of the biggest films that you love.
Sullivan's Travels was one of them.
Sullivan's Travels and the Palm Beach Story, also from Preston Sturges that year. And he was also another film that year called All Through the Night with Humphrey Bogart. And he's the comic relief in all of them. So this performance as a somewhat fictional character named Steve Martin is a bit of a departure for him. Here he is more of a guide and conscience for Jolson. And I was amazed at how casually and beautifully Demarest pulls it off. He brings so much earnestness and heart, and his reaction shots are very telling without being over the top. His character is an amalgamation of people in Jolson's life, but Demarest makes him feel whole without losing that crusty lovability that endeared him to audiences for so long. A fun little tidbit, guys. More trivia today. I don't know why. I'm just busting out with it. Demarest actually appears in the original Jazz Singer alongside the real Jolson as a character named Buster Billings. I bet Jeopardy champ didn't know that.
I did not.
William Demarest.
I didn't know it either.
William Demarest.
Oh man, great. One of the questions I had about the movie in terms of the actual filmmaking was the choice to keep so many of Demarest's reaction shots in, because you'd have Jolson character going off and being super excited, and so the emotional sort of context was a slow takeoff upward, and then you'd have these reaction shots of consternation and
concern.
Exactly, concern. Emotionally, you'd expect sort of the ball to drop, and often it wouldn't drop.
I almost want to put a pin in this. I think it's a T-word thing, if you let me get to it.
Okay.
I think you're onto something there. I will say that I do think that choice was very intelligent for some of the things that they wanted to do.
Fair enough. Well, I mean, just to wrap up on Demarest, it was great. Really good actor.
Now, let me ask you, because one thing, I think he filled those close-ups beautifully. Like, I think his reactions were very telling. And secondly, I would also say, or I ask you, did they feel awkward to you in that sense, or do you just feel like they were potentially misleading ultimately?
No, the awkwardness was in the sort of emotional storytelling. I felt myself being taken in one direction. The shot that indicated that those people around Al Jolson listening to him were going in a different direction emotionally. That's when I just wasn't sure what to expect. And it's a great moment when the audience doesn't know what to expect if it's paid off well.
It's all up for interpretation, and I have my own interpretation of that. Jim, what do you think about what William Demarest?
No, I thought he was great. And I think what Max is getting to, and I don't want to. Hopefully, I'm not going to get too much into the T thing right here. Is that those shots he read as Jolson's conscience? That's why
I said that already, bitch.
You did when?
During my whole thing, I said he's his guide and conscience.
I heard guide, but yes, yeah, absolutely. We want him to take Demarest's advice. We want him to take Steve Martin's advice, as weird as that is to say.
There was no Steve Martin in 1946.
I know.
What I found particularly funny about that, if Steve Martin was working in the teens and 20s,
it's what he would be doing.
What he would be doing. I feel really confident about that.
If it's truly his conscience, then ultimately his decision would have been maybe good or bad. And I think in the end of the film, it's not necessarily that he made the wrong decision. That's the only reason why I found that a little bit ambiguous.
I have a theory on it. Okay. One more performance that I would like to talk about is Evelyn Keyes, who plays an actress named Julie Benson, who would become Jolson's wife. In reality, she's representing famous actress and dancer Ruby Keeler, who we know from her work in the Busby Berkeley musicals alongside our old friend Ginger Rogers, Jim. Ironically, even though Jolson was in the first talkie, Ruby Keeler's films were far more successful than anything Jolson was in on screen. He was the king of Broadway, but she was much more successful in Hollywood. Evelyn Keyes made no effort to mimic Keeler in the same way that Parks mimicked Jolson, because Keeler also had a very distinct singing and dancing style. I would argue that it wasn't very good, but that's beside the point. Jim, do you know Ruby Keeler's work?
Not really. I know I've seen things with her in it.
I love Busby Berkeley musicals, but she's not very good in them. Anyway, given the name change, it seemed like a fine choice not to mimic her. I also was really impressed with her, even though she doesn't appear until the second half of the film. There's some really complicated scenes emotionally in the last act that I thought she brought a lot of maturity to, especially for someone who had not heard of. She had a small career, but this is by far her biggest role. Now, I'll get to the details in the T word, but she has a monologue in which she's trying to balance her wants and needs with that of her husband. And it's quite a tightrope walk. And she makes the choice to rush the monologue as if as the character is trying to figure out what she's saying as she's saying it, which is highly unusual for a film of its time, a rare kind of acting choice. And I think she's exquisite in the very ending, also a very complicated set of emotions, to the point where Demarest's character actually says, I don't get it. And you know what? She doesn't bother to explain, but she doesn't need to us as an audience, because I think her work in those reaction shots is the most telling. I think it's some great screen acting, especially for 1946.
Evelyn Keyes was great. Again, I love all the performances, and I think you're absolutely right. I think the monologues that she has, and I think the reaction shots that she has tell so much of her state, how much she is in turmoil about putting aside her wants and needs for Al's wants and needs.
And trying to decide where that line is. At what point is too much? Max, Evelyn Keyes, you're an actor as well.
Very complicated, interesting performance. And I don't know how much of that was really spurred on by the direction again. But yeah, I agree with you guys. I think she risked not being really sort of clearly likable took on the challenge of the weight of having to make certain decisions about her own life and her partnership with Al. Even from the beginning, when he's like, let's get married, doll. And she's basically like, you know what? Actually, I really don't know about that. You're interesting to me, but I'm not going to run off with you quite yet.
If you propose, Max, will you do it just like that?
Well, I was going to propose to you, JB.
Oh, that could be an interesting end to the sixth season, whatever we're on. Jim?
It would be really easy for another actress to come in and just be an empty vessel and not have that inner emotional life and give everything to Larry Parks and just let him bowl the character over. I'm very, very happy she made the choices that she did and made the film 100% better.
Spot on, Jim. Yeah.
This wasn't in my notes, so I'm a little off the cuff here. Let's not forget how difficult it must have been to play a real person, but without playing a real person. Because, I mean, like, there's something about acknowledging Ruby Keeler's legacy and all this. And also, you know, it was well known how abusive Jolson was as well. So, therefore, you know, like, you wanted to represent that without being overt about it. Like, I think she walks that line very carefully.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree.
All right,
lots
cool.
of nods, lots of head nodding.
Yeah.
Very little dead space.
Max is working for our audio listening audience. I appreciate that. You guys good if I move on to screenplay real quick?
Are we coming back to actors?
No, if you've got more, because those are the three main ones.
The father and to a certain degree the mom. I just thought, especially the cantor. The cantor, I thought, didn't have a very large role, but was able to bring in all these peaks and valleys into his performance. I was really, really impressed.
Especially in the last scenes.
Yeah.
Again, you got reaction shots on him where the story that was being told was a lot deeper and more complicated in the 3 seconds that they held on his face.
Yeah.
Even to a certain degree, when the kid makes his reveal to Steve Martin and Steve Martin comes over to their house and that initial, who is this guy who wants to take you off to, I believe it was Baltimore, we're going to be more complicated than just the sort of upset parents.
Jim's segment, What's His Bucket, is a spotlight for character actors. And he's one of those longtime character actors that were on studio payroll and just appear here and there in all these films and does great work consistently over the years. Just a really terrific actor and performance. And also how he balances, you talked about the weight of some of those end scenes, but he's comic relief in the middle part of the film. And I think he does a good job there too. That's a hard balance.
Yeah.
I was actually impressed at how efficient the screenplay was structurally, opening right at what is really the catalyst for Jolson in show business. No rising action that is cut straight to the chase. They got a lot of ground to cover in a biopic. And this might be the best approach, just to get straight to it. I also like how they handled exposition, and this deals with that actor a little bit. The montages with cute little asides from the parents learning show business was a charming and humorous way to make the tonic of exposition go down a little more easily. And even the ending, as soon as they're a bit of a resolution, although a surprisingly sad one, they're out. Movie's done. And I think that's very efficient structurally. I also thought the script did a nice job making this as close to a warts and all biopic that you're going to see. Even though Al Jolson was involved in this film, I felt like the screenwriters found little subversive ways to suggest the egomaniacal megalomania behind the star. On one hand, it's treated like ambition, but if you look between the lines, you can see the dark side of that. And I feel like that is the director and the screenwriter sort of working together to sort of subversively showing the dark side of Al Jolson.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's true. I think that because it was so tight and so well structured in terms of the very beginning and the very end, it actually had a little bit of a feeling of dallying towards the middle of the movie because it's not a short film. I think it's a strong screenplay. It is complex. The subversiveness, I think, is interesting. I mean, I could almost see someone like Al Jolson saying, yeah, push that up, because I am crazy. I do want the moon. Because I don't think it's inherently negative, especially in this country, to be portrayed as ambitious.
No. There's an extremity to the way he handles it. And I think it comes in the performance. I think it's like all the elements coming together. You know, even Yankee Doodle Dandy is very like rose-colored, and I love the film. That's one of the surprises of this film is maybe I'm attaching modern context to it, but I'm reading it from this perspective and seeing that when he's ambitious and all these close-ups, his reaction shots of people concerned about it, and he never listens to anyone else. He's sort of a bulldozer. So, I mean, like, there's a limit to the ambition.
Well, one could liken this film to a movie about addiction because he has his period where he's outside of his element.
Let's definitely put a pin in that. That's where I'm headed later. Jim, subversiveness or a structure?
So I think the screenplay is actually where I start to have problems with the movie. And I agree with you that it's very efficient and it moves everything along very well. I do especially like the montages with Dubuquet.
Walla Walla, they like it so much they named it twice.
Right.
I think part of the problem with the screenplay for me was there was never any impediment to Jolson. Everything broke his way.
So there's a lack of obstacles. There's a lack of conflict.
There's a complete lack of conflict. He glides he gets home. He's been at home for 2 hours. He gets his call to Broadway.
That's part of the efficiency almost. I think he sacrificed too much of the valley in order to keep things at 2 hours or just under 2 hours. That struck me as well, the call as soon as he gets home. It was one of those things where like, okay, fine.
I saw these funny little reactions. It was almost like that was the tension. That was the obstacle, was them going, I don't know if this is going to go very well. There may be something ominous ahead, and yet there never really was. That's sort of why I felt like the ending wasn't a clear-cut, sad ending, even though in many ways it's incredibly sad.
I interpret it that way. Yeah, I mean, I'm going to get to that, I think. And I agree with you, Jim, too. I mean, also the fact remains that they're telling the story before it's really over, just historically speaking. The fact is Jolson, had a meteoric rise. And his retirement, I guess, because I that's why I'm sort of impressed with the screenwriters to some degree, because they're, how the old studio system work. You're assigned this, and they've got to cobble something together. So I guess I'm impressed with that aspect of it, because there wasn't really a falling action to the story. They made it about the relationship. The second half of the movie, it's the arc of their relationship and how it relates to his career. But as far as his career was concerned, it was still pretty popular at the time that it happened.
Getting to your subversive question, I think subversive is really Larry Park.
I think part of it, yeah.
Just like it would be easy to play Julie Benson as an empty vessel, it would be really easy to play Al Jolson as always the good guy. The actor chose to drive that ambition into a little bit of addiction, the unwillingness to let go and back off from that.
He's fabulous. But I mean, to Max's point, Larry Parks does all that, but he doesn't do those reaction shots. Those reaction shots come from the director, and they add a lot.
I do. I don't think it's inherent in the screenplay, that sort of subversive element. You could have made this, Al Jolson can do no wrong, and everything that he does is just divine right, and the path before him is golden. The director and the lead actor took pains to show that there is a cost to this.
I mean, I agree that the cost, my theory is the screenwriters were involved, because some of the dialogue, I think, lend itself to that. But I mean, either way, we agree that it's there. My next question is, and I don't have a right answer to this, how important would you guys say accuracy is to a narrative biopic, something that's not a documentary?
Yeah, I would say it's very important.
I would disagree. I don't think it matters to me.
I think it should at least be pretty accurate. Sometimes characters need to be compressed. It seems like they made an awful lot.
And this is why I like the screenwriters, I think, because I was fascinated what they come up with. I actually think what they came up with was really interesting and fascinating. It is so far removed from reality in so many ways. Jolson was not discovered in the back of the theater, but I love that scene. I think it's a really fun little scene. He had an act with his brother Harry, who for years would later become his manager, sort of like a Steve Martin type. He didn't become a minstrel accidentally by taking over for a drunk. His mother died at a young age. He was actually raised by an older sister. There could be an interesting story in the actual Jolson story. It's not what we get here. But on the other hand, as a narrative piece of fiction, ultimately, I was entertained and interested. So that's why I'm not sure how important it is.
Yeah, absolutely. There is not necessarily a right or a wrong in your question. You can take a biopic and you can create absolutely everything. And in large part, that's what happened. I think you can also stick to facts. I mean, like you're saying, maybe there's another movie in his life that's actually better.
Yeah, I don't know better. I mean, I thought this was good. It might be important to some people, which is why I asked.
Sure,
I agree there's no right and wrong, but some people might feel strongly about it, which is why I asked.
I kind of felt like in some ways the movie was 2 acts. That's largely because of his relationship.
It's his rise, and then it's the story of Julie Benson.
Exactly. And you have a sense of almost asexuality in the first part of the film, because someone mentions here and there, why don't you go and find a gal, and why don't you settle down?
Which is all set up for the second half.
It does feel like all of a sudden when he sees the lovely girl, it felt a little pushed on a certain level, even though Parks is such a great performer.
It was like a very clear schism. It's like, okay,
yeah,
he's at the height of his power, now it's girl time. I agree.
Well, I would almost call that potentially a flaw, but it just stuck out to me.
I noticed it. I agree it stuck out. I was on the ride, for me personally. So
yeah.
I would say this. I enjoyed both stories, and I feel like the first half of the movie sets up what I feel like is the final point. So I do think they ultimately, and it takes a while to get there, I admit that, it ultimately works in concert. And it sounds like Jim and I are both going to get to that in the T word. Max is what hinted at the direction a little bit, and I didn't have a lot to say about the direction. I was impressed with the pace. There's a lot of ground to cover. Alfred Green, the director, managed to get it all in there. I thought the montages were effective. It sounds like Jim thought there were one too many. I thought they were even cute in times, but they didn't rely on them too much. It was just enough. I thought the scene work, especially in the second half, was very well blocked and acted, and I think that's a lot to do with Alfred Green. And the shot selection. There was the occasional off-angle shot, whether it's high or low, whatever the scene called for. More close-ups than there normally would be in a film of its time. We tended to shoot things a little wider, but there's a lot of close-ups in here. And to Max's point, reaction shots were used quite frequently and I think very effectively, and that is a great choice.
The word subversive is a very interesting word here, because although I think you have a very good point about the literal sort of representation of Al Jolson's life and his sort of meteoric shoot to stardom, I do think the film is very not subversive with regard to the whole, complete and utter disregard or ignoring the African-American presence in the film, and yet the reliance on blackface, but also this sort of glossing over of him being a Jew from Lithuania. There is no obstacle of culture that presents itself strong enough for a white American family to really get upset.
I would like to know what the feeling of having a very religious Jewish cantor walk in on his son singing Ave Maria would be.
See, this is the thing about direction. I'm going to bring it back to direction because I feel like that's not what the response was. But I do think that I saw consternation in the reaction shots. But you're right. The film didn't explore it, almost as if it felt out of bounds to do so.
Well,
absolutely.
It felt very much like everybody gets along.
There was just like a cut or two where it's like, what is my son doing in a Catholic choir? And then it's moved past it. That's the subversive element that I'm talking about, is like a director trying to like not upset the apple cart with the studio, but at the same time suggest some issue there.
Again, I feel like that's a position of choice. There is something that is amok, and we choose not to address it.
These are work for hire kind of people here. Like the directors are on staff at the studio. Handful of exceptions like the Hitchcocks and John Fords and the William Wylers of the world that maybe had more of a platform to challenge the studios. But Alfred E. Green certainly did not. He's in a situation where he's trying not to lose his job. So, in terms of making choices, he's choosing to toe the studio line the same way that Larry Parks named names, feeling pressure to do something to not upset the people that hired you.
Right. And that's why I think this is important culturally as emblematic of racist policy within the industry.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't know if you guys, I've certainly been in situations where I've turned a cheek, not necessarily about racism, but where I didn't do anything because I wanted to keep my job, especially if it didn't involve you directly. Would you like quit a job or something like that if you saw something, or like 100% would fear of your future take a role in that?
I mean, I think that is a difficult question.
Well, sure.
I think that's, and boy, we're getting away from the movie here.
I'm sort of thinking about the culture of 1940s Hollywood. You're owned by the studio, and they assign you to certain projects. Right. To not be assigned at a studio, I think was a great fear. Which is like when I see something like the subversive little reaction shots that you were talking about, I sort of like tip my cap to that, be like, okay, you didn't think you could get away with something, so you had this sort of wink to us that maybe might get past the studio censor, but lasts for posterity.
I think that's a great question, JB, because whatever criticism that I might have or we might have on this film has to be reflected back on us ultimately, because what good is it if you sit in your little room and you point fingers? That doesn't really do anything. Racism and bigotry and classism, any kind of declaration of one group being inferior and another group being superior, is a constant struggle.
Another reason why it's worthwhile to see the Jolson story and have this discussion and understand what was wrong. It's why I watch old movies in general, I think, because I mean, like, I feel like I learn more about modern life from older films, whether it's mistakes or even some values that maybe are lost along the way, like compassion, for example, I think is undervalued in modern culture.
The more we become aware of the inequalities and injustices around us, the more it becomes it is on our onus to be able to speak up and act on that.
I'm ready to go to the T-word. Is there any more in direction? And I understand we go on tangents, and that's fine. But like part of the joy is the conversational aspect of it.
No, I think we're good to move on.
This is the part that everybody really wants to get to. We keep hinting at it. Max, you know what this section is called?
Themes.
Jim, what do we call it?
The T-word.
The T-word. The T-word, ladies and gentlemen. We call it the T-word because founding member Davey used to hate talking about themes. He thought it was a little artsy. Whenever we wanted to talk about themes, the rest of us, we would dance around it and call it the T-word, so it became the name of a section. And here we are. We've all been sort of hinting around the T-word and pushing things to now, wanting to get to this point. I will start out to say, this relates to what you were saying, Jim. For me, I'm going to call it work-life balance. The first act of the film is primarily a paean to show business, a depiction of the allure of the proverbial acting bug, if you will. But by the time the second half rolls around, you begin to realize that it was all set up for what I consider to be the real theme of work-life balance. Obviously, that can apply to any industry, but perhaps doubly so for something in the entertainment industry, where success can be very fleeting. After some initial success, Jolson had a few failures, and then when true superstardom came, he was never able to take it for granted. He had to keep moving, keep producing, keep performing, and though the film only hints at this, keep dominating. His drive and ambition and constant need to produce keeps his wife, his family, and his friends on the sideline. They want to be with him and not his work. And when he realizes this and gives it up, he can't be happy. Even though I failed to have the success of Jolson, I've also struggled with this balance, having been accused by significant others of leading too ascetic a lifestyle, forcing myself to constantly be writing new material that they think would never likely be produced, or constantly watching old movies to continue to learn and improve and possibly host a talk show about them. Not working on something career-related felt like a waste of time, and that left girlfriends feeling like they were in second place, which they were and they always would be. At one point, Jolson even compares it to an addiction like alcoholism. And quite frankly, Parks kind of plays it that way. At one point, faced with the prospect of singing for his parents at an anniversary as if he were staring at a glass of bourbon for the first time in years. That's sort of what Jim was hinting at. But there's a certain character trait at the root of all that for both Jolson and myself, and that's my other theme that's tied to that. And that's narcissism. It's not just the need to perform. The film makes a big deal about the faces he sees while performing. And unlike other films of its kind, it's not about the pleasure he brings to them when he sings. I interpret it is about the pleasure they bring to him. It's about the need to not only be loved, but adored. And anything less feels like the end of the world. And that is the root of the addiction. The adoration is a fix, that applause, those faces. And like a junkie on the street, you'll do anything you can to feel it again. And that is why I think a lot of the subversive choices in the film were made. And that is why I feel like this is more than just your average 40s biopic. So, Jim, you were hinting at something similar. Did I hit it close to the mark?
I think that's exactly the mark. And for all of the parts that we talked where the screenwriters got it wrong, where they changed history, I think this is absolutely on the mark.
You're saying the choices they make that change history help that theme to be on the mark. Is that
yeah. It's explicitly true for Jolson, who ended up dying because he pushed himself on a USO tour 4 years later in 1950, going to Korea. He couldn't stop.
What's fascinating to me that brings this film just above the next thing is that he couldn't stop, but it's all about him, though. It's not his benevolent nature that makes him not stop. It's about the way they make him feel. And they don't never say it, but it's so clear to me in the way it's shot and written.
Yes, the way it's presented, it's good addiction. Oh, it makes people happy. It's okay. It's okay. And that's why I think you see Steve Martin off to the sides, who is a performer himself. And I think he is the most understanding of what is happening to Al Jolson. And you constantly see his looks of worry. Steve Martin is the entry point to seeing Al Jolson's true state.
The more we talk about this, the more interesting this whole idea of subversiveness or subversion is, because without the reflective shots of the other lead characters when Jolson is going off on his antics, you basically have nothing. You have a show about a guy who's taking off in his plane, and he just keeps going up and up and up. To the end of the film, he goes off and just continues doing his thing. He loses his wife, but as history explains to us, there are many others. The subversiveness is almost like, hey, listen, if we don't have some dark side to this character is just going to be like watching, an elephant fly. I mean, it's like unbelievable. Look at this guy go. There he goes.
That's my problem with the screenplay. Is if it were not for the director and for the performers adding that in, I think it'd be super easy to have this golden boy movie.
I actually imagine this scenario, and it's completely theoretical. Jolson's on set every day, like the real life Al Jolson, supervising his life story. I can see them sort of conspiring, and writers were on set too, so I give the writers a pass because they're dealing with him, and he was famously a megalomaniac, so they're dealing with him, and so they're finding these ways in this movie that last forever to sort of hint at some of the darker sides within the parameters within which they were working.
I sort of wonder if working with Jolson made them add in those.
I wonder that too, but I think it's fascinating, and it makes me enjoy it more because it gives it depth.
I would just venture to suggest that without those aspects, the film doesn't work as a story. And I think there are enough people in powerful positions who would say, look, Al, this just is going to flop. It's like you just doing well for 2 hours and 2 minutes isn't interesting. We need you to get in some dire situations. What we're freely calling subversive, I think there's merit to that, but I think it's also just...
It doesn't sound like you do. You gave us air quotes.
I think that a story needs its plot. Otherwise, it's something else. It's maybe a song or a monologue or a...
It is the wrong word, but it does feel to me like all the elements that add up to that conclusion for me are all sort of fringe elements. We talked about the reaction shots. I don't want to keep hammering that point home. That's a big part of it. Little things that aren't necessarily a part of the actual film that seep their way in. A line that could be interpreted a couple different ways that, that might pass by Jolson as a censor, but if interpreted in a different way, you can see it as Jolson being overly controlling. It's surprisingly subtle in those ways. And it's an interpretation on my part, but I feel strongly about it, and it makes me fascinated by the movie even more.
Yeah, I think that's it. For Max, I think Jolson would be happy if it were a 2-hour pay-on to his accomplishments.
Right.
And he would just be like, but the people love me. Just show them Swanee until they have their fill.
In terms of theme, there's an aspect of nostalgia that I think permeates this whole film. And it's nostalgia for a time period roughly 20 years prior to the movie's release. There's the nostalgia in terms of the movie-going population. There's the nostalgia in terms of Al Jolson probably on set going, no, I need it like this.
That was really good Al Jolson. Can you do the rest of the show?
You got it, baby. You got it. I think what's so fascinating about nostalgia in America, if you think about Trumpism and you think about the population embracing this idea of like, make America great again, let's get swept up into this sort of romantic situation where we don't have to acknowledge things like racism. I think it's really a great time to look at this film and reflect. I do think that it's a harsher reality, maybe, than we all want to admit. But I think it's a wonderful time to look at this film for all its artistic merit, but also for the intense reality of where we are today. We've got such a distance to go.
It's nostalgia for an America that never existed.
But that did exist in the movies.
I mean, in the same way that the Old West, the myth of the cowboy exists in the movies and not in real life.
Yeah.
And we talked about that with, it was the Wild Bunch.
Wild Bunch, now a top 10 all-time episode. All thanks to Jim. Jim, do you know what's next?
I don't know what's next.
Every classic, guys. It's the classic movie showdown.
Yay!
This is where we have two movies go head-to-head in NCAA style brackets. So tonight we're in the 40s bracket, and to explain the rules to us, ladies and gentlemen, I turn things over to our friend Max.
Thank you, JB. The rules for the classic movie showdown. Ladies and gentlemen, drum roll, please. Number 1, seeding criteria varies from bracket to bracket. Number 2, films at JB-hosted screenings need to be 15 years or older. That would be 2006. Number 3, voters are eligible if they see both films within a 12-month period. Number 4, voters must see both films in JB's presence. Uh-oh. Number 5, JB is ineligible to vote, but breaks a tie.
Jim, that might be the best reading rules we've ever seen.
It's much better than mine.
All right, so we're in the 40s bracket today, ladies and gentlemen. And so the Jolson story is a 14 seed in the 40s bracket. Does anybody know the NCAA brackets to know what a 14 seed would go up against in a first round? What number seed? They're not sports guys.
3.
It is a 3 seed. Very good, Jim. It always adds up.
Yeah, boy.
Do you know why I know that, Jonathan?
It adds up to 17?
Because the last time we did this, you said it always adds up to 17.
I say that every time, and very few people ever remember. But
that's why I won on Jeopardy.
There you go. You remember. All right, ladies and gentlemen, here we go. I'm going to reveal the bracket now. The Jolson story versus one of our 1942 films, Bambi, a film that we looked at as part of our 1942 in review. Obviously, the Disney film, much loved and much remembered. It makes a lot of people sad for some reason. I always like killing deer myself. I'm just kidding. I've never hunted. Jim has. Has everybody seen Bambi?
It's been a while, but yes.
Nobody rewatched it for tonight.
No, but seen it a few times.
I've seen it a few times. Did you rewatch it for 1942 in review?
I did, actually.
Okay, there you go. One of your 23. Just a reminder to the audience, and Max said this, I think, but the vote has already happened. I already know the winner. These guys do not. The vote already happened at that December 2018 screening. At the same time, I'm going to allow these guys to opine that what they would have voted for, probably pretty obvious, what they would have voted for had they been in attendance. Jim, Bambi versus Jolson story.
Look, I'm going to say even without the weight of history weighing down on the Jolson story, just based on the storytelling, based on the complexity of the themes being presented, I would go Bambi 100% of the time.
Okay, Max.
Slam bam, thank you, ma'am. That was exactly. I agree with Jim. None of that made sense, but I agree with everything Jim just said.
That's why you're the enigma. So you're voting for Bambi.
Yes.
Bambi it is. So I will now reveal the winner from our December 2018 screening. And here it is, ladies and gentlemen, the winner of this 314 bracket. The winner was Bambi, as it turns out. For all its flaws, the heart and joy of Bambi was ultimately more resonant for the audience. As I said, they did react surprisingly positively to the Jolson story, but Bambi was a fixture in the childhood for so many of the audience, so it was difficult to even consider voting against it. With that said, I was less enchanted with Bambi at rewatching it for the 1942 in review. I probably would have gone Jolson story myself by a hair, and there's a rabbit in that, so there's like a pun. But Bambi does move on to the second round in the 40s bracket. Gentlemen, reactions.
Yeah, that's the right choice.
There's no right or wrong, Jim.
No, that was the right choice.
No, that was the right choice.
His animation is a different animal to some degree too, but I mean, for me, the Jolson story is more resonant and a little deeper for me. Bambi's a little, it's for kids and it's a little obvious, I think. All right, guys, we've said so much, so I don't know what else we can say, but do you have closing thoughts?
We pretty much beat this horse way past death and into a mushy oatmeal-like pile, but the Jolson story, I think is if we manage to take out all of the, if he didn't do blackface, if it was just the story of a man who achieved his dreams, it would have been a good movie. It was certainly buoyed by its performances. The director absolutely helped. It is relegated to a good movie, and now a good movie with a whole lot of baggage. I know your feelings on it, Jonathan. History weighs down on it a whole lot, just as it weighs down on Al Jolson, the person.
Yeah, I just don't know how fair that is.
By itself, it is a good movie. I don't know if it rises to a great level.
I would agree with that. I don't know if I would actually use the word great. I think there are great things in it, and I enjoyed it and was ultimately fascinated. I was riveted the whole time. I might even say very good. I might be like a notch ahead of you, but not that far ahead of you. Max, closing thoughts.
I would agree with what was just said. I also think it's inextricably connected, elements of racism, and nothing's made in a vacuum. The dilemma that we face here is trying to separate aspects of the film. It's a product of a time and an environment in this country that should be studied, and so that we don't do it anymore.
I mean, I can agree with that too. For all our disagreement, there's a handful of agreements, so that's good. So in terms of trivia for the next classic, obviously this is the last classic of our 6th season. The 7th season of the No Name Cinema Society is very much in question due to some internal discussions based on some of the arguments that we had here tonight. There's some political issues internally where people feel like my certain opinions are not PC enough. So we might have to close down the No Name Cinema Society after this season, but stay tuned on Instagram and we'll let you know for sure. If we are back, it is our tradition to have the first classic of the year be one of the films from the year we studied the year before. And of course, this past year we studied 1970, and we're going to have the 1970 in review in April. So our first classic of the new season, speaking of controversy, will be a very controversial Mexican Western in which the director claims to have raped an actress live on camera during one of the scenes of the film. That's your trivia for the next classic movie discussion if we have a 7th season. Our next show, however, and our final regular season show of the 6th season will be our Sound Off, our 48 Sound Off, in which we're going to play the movie game. Devin's going to have a rant, his diatribe segment, and we're going to count down the top 5 actor biopics of all time based on our discussion tonight. All right, guys, that's coming up Monday. Max, we won't see you again for a while. Jim, we're going to see you in the top 10 of 2020.
Absolutely.
In April. Say goodnight to the audience for us, people.
Good night, audience.
Good night, audience.
There you go. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.
Is adjourned.